My story begins in a quiet suburban town where I spent my childhood, full of ambition and dreaming about making it big in the business world. I was always captivated by technology, firmly believing it held solutions to everyday problems. After college, I poured myself into building a startup focused on creating innovative surveillance equipment. The company grew, and landing our first significant contract with the Department of Defense was the beginning of several lucrative ventures. As my career started to soar, I met Jessica at a networking event. She was a charismatic accountant with a contagious laugh that drew me in. We fell in love quickly and within a year got married. Our daughter Jake arrived 2 years later, filling our lives with joy. But as my business demands escalated, I didn't see the growing gap between Jessica and me. I didn't face the reality until after our divorce, especially when I was left caring for our 3-year-old daughter. I had ignored the warning signs for far too long. The wake-up call hit me hardest during my grandfather's funeral, following his sudden heart attack. The day after, I packed up Jake and me, preparing to leave my mother's house. As I was securing her in her car seat, I asked, "Would you like to take off your shoes, sweetheart?" Her little "yes, please" always made me smile. I gently unbuckled her small Mary Janes and, knowing her preference, removed her socks too. Her toes wriggled in relief, and I gave her a playful tickle, making her laugh and kick, our little game that I cherished. These moments together had become more frequent, and I realized how much they meant to both of us, especially since it didn't feel this way with Jessica. Before I could think too deeply, Jake's soft voice pulled me back. "Daddy?" she asked as I set her shoes on the seat beside her, carefully tucking her socks inside each one. "What is it, Pumpkin?" I replied, noticing her hesitation as she looked into my eyes. "Why doesn't Mommy love us anymore?" she asked in the simplest of terms. Her question stunned me, leaving me momentarily speechless. I took a slow breath and answered, "Honey, your mommy loves us both, especially you," though I could feel how hollow my words sounded. "She loves you more than anything in the world." Her face brightened momentarily before she frowned again. "But she didn't come to say goodbye to Grandpa," she murmured sadly. All I could do was repeat Jessica's excuse. "She had to work, honey," I said, holding back the frustration. I considered explaining her big account, but it would have been too much for a 3-year-old. "Mommy will be home when we get back, baby," I added, though I wasn't sure myself. "Does she have to work at night too?" Jake asked innocently. I held back my response, knowing any mention of Jessica's frequent nights out would only lead to more questions. "No, baby girl," I replied softly. "I think Mommy's almost done with her big project and she'll have more time for us soon." I kissed her forehead, buckled her car seat, and closed the door, feeling the ache of that conversation. 20 minutes later, she was asleep in the back seat, but I couldn't get her words out of my mind. I realized that if Jake had noticed Jessica's distance, it was more than just in my head. Jessica had even hinted at it the last time I asked why she went out so often. We arrived home just as the sun was setting. Jessica was there, and Jake ran upstairs, eager to tell her about the cousins she'd met. Following her, I was weighed down by a mix of suspicions and dark thoughts that had taken root on the drive. What was keeping Jessica out so late? Friends? Work? I found her at her vanity, dressed in her underwear and applying makeup. She greeted me with a quick peck on the cheek, and it struck me that I couldn't remember the last time she kissed me with any real passion. I sat on the bed, watching as Jake tried to talk to her, but Jessica barely paid her any attention. Eventually, even Jake noticed and wandered off to her room. Jessica continued fixing her hair and makeup without a care. "What's going on, Jessica?" I asked, trying to keep my emotions in check even as my stomach knotted and heat surged up my neck. She paused, looking at me with a hint of impatience. "What do you mean, honey?" she replied, her attention drifting back to her mascara. "We've been home for 10 minutes and you're already rushing out again," I said, more sharply than I intended. She sighed, sounding fed up with the entire conversation. "Honey, you know I go out with the girls on Friday nights." I couldn't hold back. "Actually, Jessica, you go out on Saturdays, some Sundays, most Wednesdays, and nearly every Friday. Sometimes it seems like one long night out." By now, Jake had retreated to her room and I shut our bedroom door. When I turned back, Jessica was staring at me, cold and unblinking. I stepped closer, taking her hands gently. "Jessica," I said, keeping my voice steady, "Jake asked me why you don't love us anymore, and now I have to ask you the same thing." Her eyes narrowed, a signal I'd hit a nerve, but I pressed on. "Do you still love me?" She softened slightly, leaning against me as she murmured, "Of course, darling. I love you more now than when we got married." Yet her words felt hollow, and a deep sense of unease crept in. I pushed forward. "Then stay home tonight, honey," I urged. "Jake would love to have you around. We could put her to bed early, open a bottle of wine, and maybe you could wear that black lace camisole I bought you for Valentine's." Her body seemed to respond until I mentioned the camisole. Then she stiffened, subtly pulling away. I held onto her wrists. "Jessica," I said, bracing myself, "are you cheating on me?" I watched her closely, noticing the slight flicker in her eyes and the tightness around her mouth. Her pulse raced under my fingers, confirming my suspicions. "Don't be ridiculous," she protested, trying to sound lighthearted. "I could never love anyone but you." She leaned in to kiss my neck, but carefully avoided disturbing her hair. A cold chill ran down my spine. Then she patted my arms and glanced at the clock. "I'm going to be late," she said. I promised the girls I wouldn't be. "Maybe tomorrow night, Jessica. We need time together," I said, a hint of desperation slipping through. "Please tell them you'll go out another time and spend tonight with us." Jessica pulled away and grabbed a short skirt from her closet. "I can't disappoint all my friends," she said defensively. "Why would you want me to?" "Why would you want to disappoint me and your daughter?" I shot back, feeling frustration rise. "Don't we matter anymore?" Her eyes hardened with anger. "I told you tomorrow," she snapped. "I'm entitled to time for myself without you smothering me. I'm not your slave." The argument continued, with her insisting she was a free, independent part of this marriage, determined to do whatever she needed to unwind. I reminded her that she'd always had her freedom. I never protested when she returned to work after Jake was born. I supported her career, even though my income alone was more than enough for us. Yet somehow her job and nights out seemed more important than our family's needs. I got sarcastic about her girls' nights, which only made her angrier. She demanded to know what I was accusing her of, and I left before saying something I'd regret. Downstairs, I tried to cool off on the couch, wrestling with the urge to stop her from leaving, but knowing I couldn't. When she eventually came downstairs, I was calmer. We exchanged looks, hers defiant, mine conflicted. "Jessica," I said, my voice lower than usual, "please don't do this." She paused, hand on the doorknob, then stepped out without a word. Jake came running, opening the door to watch her mother's car pull away. She closed the door softly, walked over to the couch, climbed into my lap, and nestled close. We sat like that for a long time before I took her to the kitchen to make sandwiches. The rest of the weekend was tense. Jessica returned early Saturday morning, nursing a nasty hangover. After enduring her bad mood most of the day, Jake and I escaped to the park, not returning until well past dinner. Jessica accused me of abandoning her, but I replied, "You're the one who left Jake and me. Get used to us spending time alone without you." My tone shocked her, and she stayed quiet, focusing on Jake for the rest of the evening. That night, I tried to initiate some closeness between us, but her upset stomach brought it to an abrupt end. The following night, she was completely unresponsive, so I gave up and took a long, calming shower. On Monday, I left before she was up, leaving her to handle Jake's morning routine, which she despised. Before leaving, I activated a surveillance setup in the basement, capturing phone conversations and intercepting cell signals within 150 feet. Strictly speaking, it was off-limits for personal use, but Jessica's behavior left me no choice. I spent the week focusing on work, but my mind was back at home. The surveillance setup was recording everything, yet I almost wished it wasn't necessary. Still, I felt a creeping dread every time I checked the feed. Jessica's routine didn't seem out of the ordinary at first. Calls to work, chats with friends, and background noise of TV shows. But there were still those late-night calls, whispers when she thought I was asleep. I couldn't make out everything, but my instincts were screaming. By Friday night, Jessica had a familiar glow, the kind of excitement I remembered from our early years. She announced she'd be out late again, already half-dressed before I'd come home. Jake, watching from the doorway, seemed resigned, and I could see in her face that she knew the drill. Jessica looked at me with that sharp edge she'd adopted lately, daring me to object. "Have fun," I said, my voice neutral, though the weight of unspoken questions was heavy between us. That night I checked the recordings more carefully. While Jessica was out, I listened to a conversation between her and someone she called Tom. I'd never heard her mention a Tom before. I could hear her laugh, flirtatious and carefree. She sounded like she was talking to me a decade ago. My heart pounded and anger simmered as I listened to her talk about making up excuses and keeping things discreet. They mentioned meeting up at places I didn't know she went to. When she returned past 2 a.m., she was quiet as she slipped into bed. But I couldn't sleep. The confirmation stung, and I lay there, trying to keep my breathing steady, even as my world felt like it was crumbling beside me. The next day, I played it cool. I didn't confront her yet. I wasn't ready for the fallout. Instead, I took Jake to her favorite breakfast spot, letting her chatter away about anything but Jessica. For now, I wanted a moment that felt normal. That night, however, Jessica announced she'd be going out again. Something snapped in me. I followed her down the stairs, stopping her just before she reached the front door. "Jessica, we need to talk," I said firmly. She glanced back, irritation flashing across her face. "Can it wait?" "I'm meeting someone," she replied, her hand already on the doorknob. "No, it can't." I stepped closer, blocking her path. "What's going on, Jessica? Who is Tom?" Her face turned pale for a split second before she composed herself, but the flash of guilt was unmistakable. "Who told you about Tom?" she demanded, her voice hardening. "Were you snooping on me?" "I didn't need to snoop, Jessica," I replied, crossing my arms. "You've been sneaking around, lying to me, lying to Jake. Do you know how many times she's asked why you're never home?" Her anger flared, almost defiant. "I need space. I have friends outside of this house, and I'm not about to apologize for that," she shot back. "You never give me any breathing room." "Oh, right," I said sarcastically. "I'm the one suffocating you? While you're out sneaking around pretending everything's fine, do you realize how unfair this is?" She scoffed. "Unfair? I've given up years for you and Jake. I'm allowed to have a life of my own, even if that bothers you." "A life of your own?" I felt the bitterness rise in my chest. "You mean a life where you lie to me, betray our family, and still come home expecting everything to be normal?" Jessica looked me dead in the eye, her face hardened with a cruel determination. "Maybe if you weren't so wrapped up in your work, I wouldn't need someone like Tom, but you chose your career over us long ago." The words hit hard, but they were a lie, and we both knew it. "I built this life for us, Jessica. I sacrificed for you, for Jake. Don't pretend like I haven't been here trying to make this work while you've been sneaking around with some stranger." Her face twisted with something close to regret, but it faded as quickly as it appeared. "You know what?" she said, stepping back. "I'm done pretending. Maybe it's time we both start thinking about what we really want." And with that, she turned and walked out the door. I stood there watching her go, feeling a mix of anger, hurt, and relief. It was clear now that whatever we once had was gone. The following week was a whirlwind. Jessica stayed out late most nights, coming home in the early hours and barely interacting with Jake or me. Every day, Jake grew quieter, sensing the tension but too young to understand. I found myself dreading the evenings, trying to fill the silence in our home with distractions, anything to keep from facing the reality that our marriage was falling apart. One evening, as Jake and I watched her favorite movie, she looked up at me and asked, "Daddy, is Mommy mad at us?" I pulled her close, feeling the ache of her question. "No, sweetheart," I said softly, trying to keep my voice steady. "Mommy's just going through something. but I'm here and I always will be. She hugged me tightly, her small arms wrapping around my neck. At that moment, I knew I had to make a choice. Not for Jessica, not even for myself, but for Jake. This couldn't go on. We needed peace, stability, and maybe even a fresh start. The next day, I contacted a lawyer. With a heavy heart, I dialed Adam Robinson's number. Adam had been my lawyer and friend for years. We'd worked together on business contracts and company legalities, but never in a million years had I thought I'd need him for something like this. As his phone rang, I felt a strange mix of dread and relief. Dread because I knew this was the first real step toward ending my marriage, and relief because I couldn't keep living in the limbo Jessica had created. Adam answered on the second ring. "John, good to hear from you, buddy. What's going on?" I took a deep breath, steadying my voice. "Adam, I think it's time I file for divorce." He was silent for a moment, probably as surprised as I'd been just weeks earlier. "I'm sorry to hear that, John. Are you sure this is what you want?" "I didn't want this," I said, my voice thick with frustration. "But she made her choice. I can't keep pretending things are fine, not when Jake's starting to notice." We talked through the initial steps, gathering documentation, filing for temporary custody, setting up a plan to protect my business assets. Adam assured me he'd handle everything as smoothly as possible and that he'd prioritize Jake's well-being in the process. Knowing I'd have him in my corner was a comfort, but the reality of it all was hard to swallow. That evening, I waited for Jessica to come home. I was done playing along with her charade. She came in around midnight, her hair slightly disheveled and her makeup smudged, like she'd had one too many drinks. She barely glanced my way, already heading upstairs. "Jessica, we need to talk," I called after her, my tone leaving no room for argument. She stopped, glancing back with clear irritation. "Can it wait?" "I'm exhausted." I shook my head, gesturing to the living room. "Number, it can't wait." With an annoyed sigh, she followed me in and plopped onto the couch, crossing her arms. "What is it, John?" I felt a surge of anger looking at her, sitting there as if she was the one put out, as if her late nights and secrets were no big deal. I kept my voice steady. "I called a lawyer today, Jessica. I'm filing for divorce." Her eyes widened for a moment, but then her expression shifted to something defiant, almost smug. "So that's your solution? Just throw it all away?" I let out a bitter laugh. "I didn't throw anything away, Jessica. I've been here, trying to make this work, while you've been off with whoever. Do you know what Jake asked me last night? She wanted to know if you're mad at us because you're never here. How can you justify that?" Jessica rolled her eyes, her irritation intensifying. "Oh, please, don't turn this around on me. You're the one who's been too focused on work, on your success, to notice anything outside of your precious career." "That's rich coming from you," I shot back, shaking my head. "I built this life for us, Jessica, for you and Jake, and now you're blaming me for working hard to give us a good life." Her voice grew sharper. "Maybe I wanted more than just financial security, John. Maybe I wanted someone who actually cared about me, who wasn't too busy to notice when things went wrong." "You could have told me that years ago," I replied, my voice rising. "Instead, you chose to shut me out, to lie, to cheat. You think I don't know about Tom, about Brian?" Her expression flickered, betraying a hint of fear, but she recovered quickly, her face hardening. "You were spying on me?" I let out a humorless chuckle. "Spying? Jessica, I had to find out the truth somehow. You weren't exactly forthcoming." She stood up, her face red with anger. "You think you're so innocent, don't you? You think you're the victim here?" "Yes, Jessica," I replied bluntly. "In this I am. I didn't betray our marriage, I didn't lie to you, and I certainly didn't neglect our daughter for nights out with random men." The silence stretched between us, heavy and tense. She looked away, her gaze fixed on the floor. For the first time, I saw a crack in her armor, a flash of something like regret. But it was too late for apologies, too late for second chances. "I'll be moving out," I said quietly. "I'll take Jake with me until we figure out custody." She deserves stability, and I'm going to give that to her, with or without you. Jessica's face twisted with anger. You think you're the better parent? You think she won't miss me? She's already missing you, Jessica, I replied, my voice soft but unyielding. She's been missing you for months, and I'm done letting her suffer because of our problems. With that, I turned and headed upstairs to pack. The rest of the night passed in a blur as I gathered my things, Jake's clothes, her favorite toys. I didn't know where we'd go just yet, maybe a hotel for a few days, then a rental until things were finalized. But I knew I was doing the right thing, for her and for myself. When I finally tucked Jake into bed that night, she looked up at me with her wide, trusting eyes. Daddy, are we going somewhere tomorrow? I stroked her hair, swallowing the lump in my throat. Yes, sweetheart, we're going to have an adventure. Just you and me. She smiled, wrapping her small arms around my neck. I held her tightly, feeling a strange mix of sadness and hope. My marriage might be ending, but I still had Jake, and that was something no one could take from me. In the days that followed, I felt a strange sense of calm as I adjusted to our new routine. Jake and I found a small apartment nearby, nothing fancy but cozy and warm. Each night I read her bedtime stories, tucked her in, and promised her that things would get better. Slowly but surely they did. We found a new rhythm, a new normal. As for Jessica, I still saw her occasionally, handling custody exchanges and brief, tense discussions. I kept things civil for Jake's sake, but there was no going back. The love I'd once felt for her had been replaced with a quiet sadness, a sense of loss for what we'd once shared and what could have been. In time, I knew I'd heal. I'd learned the hard way that trust, once broken, couldn't easily be rebuilt. But I'd also learned that I could move forward, that Jake and I could find happiness even after the storm. And for now, that was enough. In the months that followed, life settled into a new routine. Jake and I were doing well on our own, and I was finding strength in the small moments we shared. Every morning, I'd make her pancakes. She liked them with blueberries arranged in the shape of a smiley face. I'd drop her off at preschool, then head into work, diving into projects that kept me focused and driven. The business was thriving, which brought me a strange sense of satisfaction. Despite the chaos in my personal life, at least my professional world was stable. Occasionally, Jessica would call or text, mostly about custody arrangements. She seemed distant, almost like a stranger, and I preferred it that way. When I dropped Jake off at her place, I'd keep the conversations brief, barely looking her in the eye. I didn't need to see the remnants of our life together scattered around her apartment, reminders of the trust she'd shattered. But as the divorce proceedings moved forward, there were days when the weight of everything hit hard. I'd be alone in my quiet apartment after Jake had gone to bed, with nothing but the faint hum of the refrigerator to keep me company. Memories would flood back, the laughter we'd once shared, the dreams we'd built together. I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness knowing that somewhere along the line those dreams had died. One evening after Jake had fallen asleep, I received a text from Jessica. My heart sank as I read her message. Can we meet to talk? I stared at the screen, feeling a mix of dread and curiosity. Part of me didn't want to see her at all, but another part wanted answers, to understand how we'd ended up here. I finally agreed, suggesting a neutral spot, a small coffee shop a few blocks from my apartment. The next day, I found myself sitting across from her at a small table, the smell of coffee lingering in the air. She looked tired, as though the toll of the last few months had worn on her. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, regret maybe. But I didn't let my guard down. Thanks for meeting me, John, she started, stirring her coffee slowly. I know I've hurt you, and I don't even know where to start. Try the truth, I said simply, my voice steady. That's all I ever wanted from you, Jessica. She looked down, biting her lip. I don't know why I did it. I was lonely, and I thought I needed something more. You were so focused on work, and I felt invisible. I swallowed, feeling a rush of anger mixed with sadness. And instead of talking to me, you went behind my back. You made me feel like a fool. I know, she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. I was selfish. I see that now. I ruined everything. There was a part of me that wanted to believe her, to forgive and move on, but I knew that too much damage had been done. I'd spent months trying to understand her choices, but they were choices that had cost us everything. "What's done is done, Jessica," I said, my voice soft but firm. "I'm focused on Jake now. She deserves parents who are honest, who put her first. I'm not interested in rehashing the past or placing blame. I just want to move forward, for her." She nodded slowly, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I get that. I wanted you to know that I'm sorry for everything." I sat back, exhaling deeply. Maybe that apology was something I needed to hear. Maybe in some way it helped to close a chapter I'd been holding on to, but it didn't change the reality we'd created. "Thank you," I said, standing up to leave. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Jessica, but it's not me." As I walked out of the coffee shop, I felt a strange sense of peace, like a weight had been lifted. I'd spent so long carrying the hurt and anger, but now for the first time I felt free to let it go. My focus was on Jake and building a future that was steady and honest, a life built on trust and love, the way it should be. That night I tucked Jake into bed, kissing her forehead as she drifted off to sleep. I promised her silently that I'd always be there, that I'd protect her from the kind of hurt Jessica had caused. And as I turned off the light, I knew that whatever lay ahead, we'd face it together. Just me and my little girl carving out a new beginning, one day at a time. I pulled myself together and shifted focus. Things were heading in a different direction. "I'll see you at the office tomorrow morning," I said. "Okay, sure, John," he agreed. "Hey, take it easy tonight, all right? Don't do anything you'll regret," he added, his tone genuine. He was giving me a warning, not to do something reckless, especially when it came to Jessica. "I'm fine, Brian," I replied, though I didn't feel it. "I intercepted the messages 3 hours ago and I'm over it," I continued. But then I paused before adding, "I won't be sleeping with her tonight, or ever again." I'd have to come up with an excuse, but I couldn't bring myself to sleep with someone who'd betrayed me. "I know it complicates the investigation," I admitted, "but I just can't." "That's fine," Brian said, trying to sound soothing. "It might take longer, but people who cheat always think they're smarter than everyone else. They believe they can hide it, but they're predictable, and that makes them easy to track." I didn't say anything. I just sat there, my mind too clouded with anger and confusion. "Hang in there, boss," Brian said, his voice a little more encouraging. "You'll come out of this stronger, no matter what." "Yeah, I will," I muttered, though part of me wasn't sure. All I could see ahead of me was a path filled with suffering and humiliation, for me and for my daughter. I hadn't even begun to think about the heartbreak it would cause her. "All right, John, call me if you need anything, even if it's just to talk," Brian said before hanging up. I promised I would, then turned off my phone and activated the intercept equipment again. I had to keep monitoring for any more communications between Jessica and her lover. I spent the night in the guest bedroom telling Jessica I had a sore throat and congestion that might make me snore. She didn't argue. She was too uninterested. I also mentioned it would be closer for Jake if she needed us, but Jessica just shrugged and went back to her magazine. Jake's emotional issues were hardly a concern for her. The next afternoon, Brian gave me a preliminary report. Jessica's lover is Dean. He's an accounting executive in her office, one of the 3 division supervisors. Like Jessica, he's married. He has a 9-year-old son and a 7-year-old daughter. His wife Lily works part-time as an insurance agent. I didn't need any more details to know the kind of man he was. "What's he like?" I asked. "Brian's 38th, taller but slimmer than you. He's not as built as you. He probably runs more than he lifts weights. Looks decent, I guess, but nothing to write home about." I couldn't understand what drew Jessica to him. What made her decide to break our vows for a guy like that? "I don't get it," I said, shaking my head. Brian had bribed a phone company contact to get a 2-year history of Jessica's phone records. A quick look showed a few calls at first, but the frequency had increased steadily, weekly about 6 months ago, and now it was daily, often at night or early in the morning. They'd usually talk after I left for work or when I was downstairs lifting weights, Brian noted. Do you know what happened around the time the calls increased? He asked, his tone businesslike, which made it easier for me to handle. I leaned back in my chair, thinking. She went to that training seminar in Chicago a couple of weeks before the calls started getting more frequent. I remember taking her to the airport, and Brian was there, getting on the same plane. That could have been the start of it. Brian nodded. Too many things point to that. I don't believe in coincidences either. He checked his notepad. That's all we have for now, but we've got digital copies of all your joint credit card activity for the past year. We'll also check your bank records today and update you on what we find. I was impressed by how much they'd gathered in just 2 days. How'd you get all this without my authorization? I asked, half suspicious. I was considering confronting the banks and phone companies about releasing private info so easily. Brian grinned. You authorized all of it. I raised an eyebrow. What? He chuckled. Boss, you don't read the fine print when Emily hands you a stack of paperwork, do you? I couldn't help but smile and nod. I used to trust Emily almost as much as I trusted my wife. Now Emily had the upper hand. All right, I said, raising my hands in surrender. Go ahead, do what you need to do. Fight the bad guys and girls. By Thursday, Brian and his team had gathered a mountain of information on my wife and her lover. 2 investigators had gone to Chicago and found several people who remembered seeing Jessica and Brian being close at the seminar. A desk clerk even thought they were married until he noticed their different last names. Several hotel staff recalled them stumbling to their rooms early in the morning after heavy drinking. One manager had to ask them twice to tone down their risque behavior. Brian's investigators were negotiating with the hotel to see if security footage was still available for a fee, likely involving an under-the-table payment. I nodded, understanding the implication. A freelance operative had started working at Jessica's office earlier than expected and confirmed that Jessica and Brian were an item. Their mutual boss knew about the affair and had warned them to keep it quiet. Jessica had already lost a performance increase because of it. I made a mental note to tell my attorney about that. It showed how the company didn't enforce its moral clauses. The freelancer working in payroll had already obtained copies of both Jessica and Brian's pay records, along with their time and attendance logs. It seemed they were taking off 1 or 2 afternoons a week for their rendezvous. The credit card data also showed that Brian was a cheapskate. Jessica was paying for most of the motel rooms they used on the outskirts of town, a clear sign of how tasteless and cheap their affair was. Jessica's group of friends, the ones she claimed to be meeting at night, were mostly single or recently divorced women. These women were looking for men, and although Jessica had sworn them to secrecy, most of them, except for Lola, were quick to spill the details to Brian's investigators. For $100, they gave dates, times, and places for most of Jessica and Brian's meetings. Most of these women hadn't seen Jessica in 2 months, but Lola. She immediately called Jessica after being questioned, furious and claiming I had no right to check up on her. She suspected it was me who had sent the investigators. Lola had a history of getting involved in these kinds of situations. She'd been divorced twice for infidelity and had a reputation for seducing married men. Even though she didn't work in the same building as Jessica, she'd somehow joined her group and seemed to be encouraging the affair. Brian had cloned Jessica's cell phone, ensuring that the $100 bribes kept the other women quiet. They reassured Jessica that they hadn't revealed anything, but Jessica was too naive to realize the truth. She just assumed her friends were keeping her secret safe. I was in awe of how much information Brian's team had gathered in such a short amount of time. Brian and Jessica were amateurs. Brian was the professional. They didn't stand a chance. The rest of that week and the next 2 were relatively quiet at home. Jessica canceled all of her usual outings except for the Friday night ones. Brian's agents confirmed that the ladies went to clubs, danced with anyone who asked, and then went home. Brian stayed home with his family. One of the reports even suggested that his wife wasn't exactly thrilled with his sudden change in behavior. I was surprised by how short-lived the effect of the investigators' questioning had been. It was as if Jessica and Brian had grown arrogant, thinking they could just carry on like nothing had happened, that I wouldn't catch on. But 3 weeks after Brian's team had questioned the group, the cell phone intercepts started to pick up again, more frequent and far more explicit. Jessica and Brian thought everything had blown over. They were convinced I was oblivious to what was going on. During this time, I nearly moved into the spare bedroom completely. I could barely stand to kiss Jessica on the cheek anymore, let alone sleep with her. Even when she hinted at it, I refused. Instead, I spent my nights reading Jake every book in her library, and I even bought more so we could keep reading together. I also developed a dry, harsh-sounding cough, just another excuse to stay away from Jessica. She didn't question it, thankfully. Brian's team picked up on the late-night calls between Jessica and Brian, noting that the frequency of the calls had spiked again. On the third Wednesday, they arranged to meet at their usual cheap motel. Brian's team was ready to catch them in the act. My attorney, Adam, had prepared me for the inevitable. I arranged for Mandy, a 16-year-old neighbor, to babysit Jake that night. "Jessica," I said, standing in the living room as she was about to leave, "please don't go out tonight." She turned to look at me, annoyance flashing in her eyes. "Please, Jessica," I pleaded, my voice sincere. "I don't want you to cheat on me." "John," she snapped, but then softened, trying to act calm. "Nothing's going on. I'm just going out for drinks and maybe some dancing. That's all," she said, offering me a convincing look. She even hugged me like she was trying to reassure me, but I wasn't reassured. "Jessica," I said, voice trembling with frustration, "I know you're meeting someone tonight. You can't honestly think he means as much to you as Jake and I do. Please don't go." She pulled back, suspicious. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her tone sharp. She was a good actress trying to play the part of the innocent, betrayed wife. "I just know," I said, my voice low, filled with pain. "You're cheating on me, and on Jake, and it's not fair." She relaxed a little, clearly thinking I only had suspicions. "I'm not cheating on you," she said, her voice firm but now tinged with frustration. "I'm tired of these accusations. If you keep this up, I might just find someone else to take care of my needs." I looked away, trying to control the rage building inside of me. "Jessica," I said, struggling to speak through the anger. Not another word. She cut me off, voice hardening. "I have never, am not, and never will cheat on you. Does that satisfy you?" She stormed toward the door, putting on a light jacket. That's when I noticed. She wasn't wearing a bra, and there were no panty lines under her miniskirt. "Jessica," I said, trying to remain calm, "if you ever cheat on me, that's it. The marriage is over. Do you remember what we talked about when Georgia and Sam broke up last year?" Her hand paused on the doorknob for just a moment. "I told you," she said, her voice controlled but dripping with condescension. "I swear I don't want any man but you, and I never will." She didn't even look back at me as she added, "Now I'm late and I have to go," before opening the door and walking out. 20 minutes later, I joined Brian and 3 of his best operatives in a room next to where Brian and Jessica would soon be arriving. They were starting to get nervous with all the questions being asked about them and Jessica's friends getting interrogated. Brian and Jessica were driving around aimlessly, trying to see if they were being followed. The GPS devices confirmed no one was tailing them. Brian had the motel reservation as soon as it was made, thanks to the desk clerk who had been paid off to tip us off. Since we knew their destination, we didn't even need to follow them. If necessary, Brian could have used several cars to tail them without being noticed, with the help of the GPS devices in their vehicles. Soon after I arrived, Jessica and Brian pulled up to the motel. They parked in front of room 113, oblivious to the dark van across the street that was recording their every move. They embraced and kissed passionately, unaware they were being filmed. Brian kept a close eye on me, knowing I wanted nothing more than to storm out and confront them both right then and there. Brian's voice was quiet but serious as he leaned in. "It's going to get worse. Can you handle this?" I sat down on one of the motel room's beds, feeling a sudden dryness in my mouth. "Do you have anything to drink?" I asked, my voice hoarse. He misunderstood and shook his head, then reached into his bag. "Take this," he said, offering me a small yellow Valium tablet. "It'll help calm your nerves." I accepted the pill, swallowing it with a soft drink from the cooler Brian had brought. As I did, I couldn't help but think about how surreal everything was. Brian had hidden a high-end digital camera in the room's air conditioning vent. It had full color, a wide range of motion, and a 25x zoom designed to capture every detail. Not that Brian expected much detail to be necessary. We all knew how things would unfold. Once Jessica and Brian went inside, everything escalated quickly. Jessica, as suspected, wore no underwear, and she was out of her dress in seconds. Brian followed suit, and soon they were on the bed. We dimmed our lights, and two of Brian's agents positioned fiber optic cameras, one under the door and one above it. These tiny cameras, no bigger than a quarter-inch in diameter, slipped easily through the door gaps. They taped the transmitters to the outside wall, making them nearly impossible to detect. To ensure they wouldn't be noticed, Brian's team unscrewed the nearby outside light before returning to the room. The cameras were now set up and transmitting, and we settled in to watch, confident we wouldn't miss anything. The show, however, was underwhelming. There was no foreplay, no tenderness, no affection. Brian just slapped on a yellow rubber and went straight for the act. Watching Jessica's face, I couldn't tell if she was in pain or pleasure. "Damn," I muttered under my breath. "That guy's no bigger than me." Actually, I was a little proud of that. Jessica had measured me several times when we first got married, and she'd always said I was on the high end of average. She used to call out for my big tool when we were together, but Brian was definitely on the low end of average. He was having to work hard just to give her any kind of satisfaction, and his technique was clumsy and crude. My pride was slightly redeemed when Sam, one of Brian's agents, glanced at my lap, then at the TV monitors, shaking her head with a smile. I saw a bit of speculation in her eyes, but we both quickly looked away. She worked for me after all, and I wasn't about to mix business with pleasure. She was cute, though. Maybe in the future there might be an opening for a new bedmate, but soon after there was nothing more to see. Brian and Jessica would continue their affair and rest, only to start it all over again. What was Jessica seeing in this guy? Why was she throwing away 6 years of marriage for him? The two didn't meet again for a week, both frustrated by their schedules not aligning. Then Lola, Jessica's friend, suggested a weekend trip to Las Vegas. The investigators knew a lot about Lola. She was a spiteful woman, estranged from her family due to her own infidelities. A monitored phone call revealed that Lola had won 2 free tickets to Vegas and invited Jessica to join her. It was clear that Lola intended for the trip to be a hookup destination. She mentioned buying 24 condoms. Jessica agreed, but she invited Brian, disrupting Lola's plans. Lola wasn't happy about it, but she didn't protest when she found out Brian would join them. Brian had to pay for his own way, which he complained about, showing just how cheap he was. He had expected Jessica to cover the cost of his trip. Adam, my lawyer, was preparing to subpoena Lola. She had known both Jessica and Brian were married, and she had facilitated their affair by arranging the Vegas trip. Adam doubted he could get any money from her, or that the lawsuit would go far, but his goal was to scare her enough that she wouldn't try to wreck another marriage again. We debated whether to confront Jessica now with the motel footage or wait for the Vegas trip. I wanted to end the deceit immediately and start divorce proceedings, but Adam suggested giving them more rope to hang themselves. The Vegas trip would be more damning, especially if Jessica showed blatant disrespect for our marriage vows. It would catch her clearly over the line. Brian's team stayed at the same hotel in Vegas as Lola, Brian, and Jessica. Brian had arranged a $500 bribe to ensure Jessica got a room with a direct line of sight to the trio. Brian's cameras were ready to capture anything that happened. People in high-rise hotels often feel invisible due to the height and distance, so Brian had seen this scenario before. Even if the shades were drawn, his team had a laser device that could capture sound vibrations from the window, allowing them to record voices clearly enough for court. They also planned to tape a phone conversation. I was to call Jessica and try to make one final plea for her to come back, using a script my lawyer had provided. As I waited, I felt intense emotions, hot flushes, chills, nausea. I hadn't eaten all day and it was catching up with me. Brian's team had left me at home, but I had a great view through the cameras. They were already on the plane to Vegas, drinking heavily. A detective reported that they had nearly worn out the stewardess by constantly ordering little bottles of booze. By the time they landed, they were drunk. I dialed Jessica's number, my heart pounding. On the webcam, I saw her on her knees on the bed being screwed by Brian from behind. She contorted her body to grab the phone on the nightstand with Lola eagerly watching the scene unfold. "Jessica," I said, my voice trembling. "Please, honey, don't have sex with that man." I almost slipped and said his name, but I had to pretend I didn't know it. "Come home, babe, please. We can work something out." I tried to sound coaxing, just as my lawyer had advised, hoping to show Jessica's complete unfaithfulness. "Jessica, think of Jake. Think of what ruining our marriage will do to her." It was amazing how long a man holds out hope, even when witnessing something beautiful being shattered. I still loved Jessica, but at that moment I couldn't stand her. Her response came immediately. "Screw you, John," Jessica screamed into the phone. "I've told you before, you stupid crap. I'm not having sex with anyone. I've had it with your damn suspicions." I shook my head, disgusted by her duplicity. How could she say that while she was unclothed, lying beside the man screwing her? When I hung up, I was astounded by her lies. She moved closer to Lola, watching them go down on each other. "But I'll tell you this, sweetheart," Jessica said, her voice dripping with vindictiveness. "I might pick up some creep tonight and bring him to my room. How's that, honey? Would you like that? I'll do it just so you can be right for once. How would that be, dear?" I was stunned by her cruelty. This was the same woman who used to seek comfort in my arms when her aunt passed away. Now she was throwing it all away. "Jessica," I said, my voice shaking, "I don't know what else to say. Think about what you're doing to Jake, for God's sake." She cut me off with another shrill scream. "Go to hell and take her with you," she shouted, nearly incoherent. I only understood her because I could see her lips on the monitor. "When I get home, we're going to have this out. You'll be lucky if I don't leave your sorry ass. Got that?" She screamed some more incomprehensible things, then stabbed at the off button, throwing the phone between the bed and the wall. She staggered back to the bed, motioning for Brian to resume. Sunday morning came and Brian's team dismantled the operation. They packed up the equipment, wiped down the monitors, and left the motel, looking exhausted. I was left with more information than I knew what to do with. Videos, pictures, phone transcripts, financial analysis. It was a mountain of evidence. My attorney, Adam, was overwhelmed but determined to file for divorce by noon on Monday. He would have 6 months to review everything before the state would finalize the divorce. We had vivid video footage of Jessica, naked and screaming curses at me while Brian was inside her. The footage was captured through an open window, making it legitimate and usable evidence in court. We also had surveillance footage from my home showing Jessica's indifference to Jake's welfare. One clip even showed Jessica leaving as Jake ran down the stairs, and another showed her being short with Jake for no reason at all. One particularly damning clip even had Jessica telling Jake to get her own breakfast because she didn't have time. All of this was bundled together and presented to a judge early Monday morning. The judge granted a temporary restraining order, giving me full custodial rights until the family court could review the case. Another order kept Jessica away from Jake until the judge could determine further action. Several other motions were granted with little hesitation. It was impressive what wealth and influence could achieve when pushed. Actually, my attorney was benefiting greatly from this. He was making a small fortune from the case, and I was helping him along the way. Monday mornings at the accounting firm were rough. Most of the staff were heavy drinkers, and many of them partied from Friday night until Sunday evening. Those who weren't hungover loitered around their desks or stood by the coffee machine, waiting for the drinkers to pull themselves together. I always kept to myself, especially when the big man in the gray suit entered the building just after lunch. Some of the hopeful women watched him walk down the aisle, but he showed no interest in them. His eyes kept glancing at a photograph in his hand as he walked, looking for someone. After a brief search, he found the woman he was looking for. He stopped in front of her and her reaction was clear. She wasn't happy about the situation. She turned toward him with dark, troubled eyes, trying to pull away from the two men she had been talking to. "Jessica Harris?" the big man asked in a deep, rumbling voice. She turned and nodded, her face twisted in discomfort. Something haunted her, and it showed in every line of her face. She focused on the man in front of her as he took a thick envelope from his inside coat pocket. "You, madam," he said in a booming voice, ensuring everyone in the room heard him, "are served." He paused for effect, making sure he had her attention before setting his briefcase on a nearby desk. He began to pull out legal documents, thin onion skin papers backed with heavier baby blue sheets, and handed them to Jessica one by one. "This," he said, "is a copy of the divorce petition filed this morning. Mr. John Harris intends to divorce you as soon as possible." He handed her another set of papers. "This, madam, is a court order prohibiting you from coming within 1,000 feet of the residence you once shared with Mr. Harris." He dropped yet another set of papers into her hands. "And this," he continued, "is a temporary restraining order forbidding you from contacting Mr. Harris's daughter, Jake Rio Harris, in any way. You may not call, email, write, or attempt to speak to Miss Harris." The look on Jessica's face as she absorbed what was happening was priceless. It was a mix of shock and rage, and I almost felt a sense of satisfaction watching it all unfold from afar. The big man stood tall, his presence filling the room. He wasn't done yet. As he handed over the last set of papers, he looked Jessica square in the eyes, letting the weight of the situation sink in. "I'd advise you to read through all of these carefully, Jessica," he said, his voice deep and commanding. "You've got a lot to answer for, and if you think this is bad, just wait. There's more coming." He left her standing there, clutching the papers, the sting of humiliation hanging in the air. The room had fallen silent, and everyone's eyes were on her. Some of the women were still watching with curiosity, while others exchanged glances, unsure of whether to pity her or be relieved it wasn't them in the spotlight. Jessica didn't speak a word as the man left. Her face was a mixture of disbelief and anger, but she stood there, frozen for a moment, holding the legal papers like they were hot coals. She finally turned away from the others and walked briskly down the hall, her mind clearly racing, no doubt calculating what her next move would be. Meanwhile, I was back at home, pacing in the small space I'd created for myself, trying to gather my thoughts. I knew there was no going back. The damage was done. I had all the proof, the documents, the footage, everything I needed to start over and protect Jake. I couldn't allow Jessicato continue this charade, to live in a fantasy world while I kept pretending everything was fine. I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't stop spinning. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face again, angry and defiant, hearing her voice as she screamed into the phone earlier. Her words had cut through me like knives, but I couldn't ignore what I had seen with my own eyes. I had seen enough to know that there was no redemption for her, at least not for me. Brian and his team had done their job well. They had collected all the evidence I could ever need, but part of me felt numb. Was this the victory I thought it would be? Or was it just another sign of how far we'd fallen, how much we had lost? The next few days dragged on. Adam kept in constant contact, making sure everything was moving forward with the divorce filing, the restraining orders, the custody arrangements. It was all happening too quickly, and I couldn't help but wonder if I was ready for what came next. I had spent so long trying to make things work with Jessica, hoping against hope that she would change, that she would come back to me. But deep down, I knew she wasn't coming back. Not now, not after everything. By the time I walked into Adam's office on Monday, the reality had set in. The papers were filed and everything was in motion. I took a seat across from Adam, who gave me a nod of acknowledgement, but there was no comfort in his expression. He was businesslike and his focus was solely on the case, which meant I had to be as well. "We're on track," Adam said, flipping through the stack of documents. "The judge granted the temporary orders and we have solid evidence. We've got the upper hand, John. I nodded, but felt no relief. The weight of it all was heavier than I expected. This wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about survival. Jake's survival. I could feel my resolve hardening, but inside I was still wrestling with the grief, with the anger, and with the emptiness of what had been. When Adam mentioned filing for divorce that same afternoon, I didn't even blink. It was the only logical step left to take. I signed the papers and handed them back to him, not looking for anything beyond the next move. The rest of the day passed in a blur, and before I knew it, we were in court. It wasn't as dramatic as I had imagined, but the gravity of it was clear. The judge went through the motions, listening to Adam's arguments and the evidence we had compiled. Every video, every photo, every phone transcript, and every witness statement was laid bare before her. It felt surreal, like I wasn't even in my own life anymore. The woman I had loved, the mother of my child, was now a figure in a court case, a woman who had broken every vow, every promise, and had dragged her family into this mess. Jessica wasn't there. She had been served the papers and the orders, but she was nowhere to be found. Part of me wondered where she was, if she was holed up somewhere, crying or drinking herself into oblivion, or if she was out there with Brian planning her next move. But none of that mattered anymore. What mattered now was Jake, my daughter, and making sure she was safe and protected from the fallout of her mother's choices. The hearing went smoothly. The judge issued the temporary custody orders and set the next date for a full hearing. I couldn't help but feel like this was just the beginning, the first step in a long and painful process, but it was a step I had to take, for Jake, for my own peace of mind. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I couldn't shake the image of Jessica from my mind. I kept hearing her voice, her angry, spiteful words, over and over again. Go to hell. Take her with you. It felt like she had ripped something from me that I would never get back. That woman, the one I had loved and shared everything with, was gone. In her place was someone unrecognizable, someone who had chosen this path, chosen to destroy everything for a cheap thrill, for a few fleeting moments of selfish pleasure. I poured myself a drink, the burn of the alcohol matching the burn in my chest. I stared out the window, lost in thought. I should have felt victorious. I should have felt like I'd won. But all I felt was emptiness. The divorce was final not long after. There were more court hearings, more back and forth between lawyers, but in the end it was over. I was free. Jake was with me where she belonged. And Jessica was gone from our lives, though she still found ways to make things difficult. There were battles over visitation, over the financial settlement, and even over things as trivial as whether she could attend family events. But in the grand scheme of things, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I had a chance to rebuild, a chance to offer Jake the stable, loving environment she deserved. I never spoke to Jessica again after the divorce was finalized. I didn't need to. The woman I had married no longer existed. The person who had chosen to break our family apart for her own selfish desires was not someone I could ever reconcile with. It took me time to heal, a lot of time, but I did. I focused on Jake, on being the father I always wanted to be. I made sure she knew she was loved, that she was safe. I did my best to shield her from the fallout, but there were times when it was impossible. She saw the toll it took on me, the nights I stayed up thinking about what could have been, about the family we used to be. But through it all, we moved forward, slowly but surely. Jake grew older, and I found a new rhythm to life. I even began to think about what the future might look like without Jessica in it. It wasn't easy, but with each passing day, the pain lessened. And one day I realized that the past, as painful as it was, didn't have to define me. It didn't have to define Jake. We could make our own future, one step at a time, and leave behind the broken pieces of the past. I guess that's all you can do when the woman you loved betrays you in every way imaginable. You move forward, you heal, and you rebuild.